The Guanches, lost mummies of the Canaries. In 2017, researchers published the results of an ancient DNA study that finally resolved one of the longest-standing mysteries in the archaeology of the Atlantic world. The subjects were the Guanches, the indigenous people of the Canary Islands, a volcanic archipelago sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 100 kilometers off the northwestern coast of Africa. Their mummified remains, preserved in the cold darkness of volcanic caves for over 1,000 years, gave up their genetic secrets to modern sequencing technology. And what the DNA revealed was not what the myths had promised, but something in many ways more remarkable. The Canary Islands were, by any geographic measure, an improbable place for a human civilization to develop in isolation. The 7 main islands, Tenerife, Gran Canaria, Lanzarote, Fuerteventura, La Palma, La Gomera, and El Hierro, rise from the Atlantic floor in a chain, the product of volcanic activity that continues today on several islands. The closest point to the African mainland is less than 100 kilometers, but for a people with no ocean-going vessels, no boats capable of crossing open water, those 100 kilometers were as impassable as an ocean. When European sailors first reached the Canary Islands in the 14th century, they found something that confounded every expectation. The islands were not empty. They were inhabited by people who had clearly been living there in complete isolation from the rest of the world for a very long time. These people were the Guanches, a name derived from the indigenous words for person and Tenerife. They lived in stone houses and volcanic caves. They kept goats and pigs. They grew grain. They wore garments made from animal hides. And they had developed, independently, a practice of mummifying their dead, using techniques strikingly similar to those of ancient Egypt. Removing internal organs, treating the body with plant-based substances, and wrapping the remains in carefully prepared animal skins. The question that echoed through every early European account of the Canary Islands was the same one the DNA study would eventually answer. Where did these people come from? The isolation of the Guanches was not just geographic. It was biological and technological. They had no metal. They had no pottery wheel. They had no written language. And they had no boats capable of ocean crossing, which paradoxically meant that once they were on the islands, they could not leave, any more than new arrivals could easily reach them. The mummification practices of the Guanches are, by any assessment, one of the most remarkable independent developments in the history of ancient technology. The process, as reconstructed from the physical evidence of recovered mummies and from the accounts of early Spanish observers, was elaborate and deliberate. The body was first cleaned and dried. The internal organs were removed through incisions, the specific pattern of which varied by island and possibly by social status. The body cavity was then packed with a mixture of materials that varied in composition, but typically included aromatic plants, bark, sand, and other desiccating substances. The skin was treated, the incisions were sealed, and the body was carefully wrapped in multiple layers of cured goat or sheepskin, stitched together with thin leather cords in a distinctive pattern. The result, in the dry cold of the high-altitude volcanic caves where burials were placed, was preservation that could last centuries or longer. Excavations of cave burial sites on Tenerife and Gran Canaria have recovered mummies in extraordinary condition, with skin intact, hair preserved, and features recognizable. Some of these individuals have been subjected to the full range of modern forensic analysis, CT scanning, isotope analysis, DNA extraction, and facial reconstruction. The mummies are currently distributed between several museum collections, with significant holdings at the Museo Arqueológico Nacional in Madrid and the Museo de la Naturaleza y el Hombre in Tenerife, which holds what is generally considered the finest collection of Guanche mummies in the world. The DNA extraction from these specimens, required working with material that, despite excellent preservation of soft tissue, had been subjected to significant chemical degradation of the genetic material over centuries. The dry volcanic cave environment that preserved the physical structure also created chemical conditions unfavorable to DNA survival. Researchers focused on the petrous bone, the dense inner ear bone that consistently outperforms other skeletal elements for ancient DNA recovery, supplemented by tooth root material where petrous bone was unavailable. The samples sent to the ancient DNA laboratory in 2017 represented the first systematic genomic study of Guanche biological origins. The results came back, and the mystery of who the Guanches were finally had a scientific answer. The mummies themselves have been controversial as museum objects since the 19th century, when collectors and researchers removed significant object. The DNA analysis of Guanche remains, published in Current Biology in 2017 by a team from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, produced a clear and specific result. The Guanches were most closely related genetically to the Berber peoples of North Africa, the Amazigh, the indigenous inhabitants of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, whose presence in North Africa predates the Arab expansion of the 7th century AD by thousands of years. The specific genetic affinity pointed most strongly toward populations from northwestern Morocco, the region of Africa geographically closest to the Canary Islands. This finding confirmed and gave precision to what linguistic scholars had long suspected on the basis of the Guanche language, which contains structural and lexical features consistent with ancient Berber linguistic traditions. The DNA and the language pointed to the same source population, North African Berbers who had somehow made the crossing to the Canary Islands, most likely beginning between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The discovery demolished the Atlantis hypothesis, the romantically appealing but evidentially unsupported theory that the Guanches were survivors of a lost Atlantic civilization. It also demolished the proposals that they had arrived from the European mainland or had any pre-Columbian contact with the Americas. They were African, specifically North African, specifically Berber. But the DNA also revealed something that the comparison with mainland Berber populations made vivid. The Guanches were Berber in origin, but they were not identical to any living Berber population. Thousands of years of complete genetic isolation from the mainland had allowed the accumulation of genetic drift, random changes in the frequency of genetic variants that occur in small, isolated populations over time. The Guanches had become genetically distinct from their North African relatives, carrying a specific combination of variants shaped by centuries of island life. Interestingly, the DNA confirmed what European observers had reported about Guanche physical appearance. The presence of light eye color variants was confirmed in the ancient genomes, consistent with the frequencies expected in the ancestral North African population from which they derived. The 2017 study also addressed the question of whether any significant genetic input from sub-Saharan Africa or from the Iberian Peninsula was present in the pre-contact Guanche population. Among all the cultural achievements of the Guanches, one stands out as unique in the entire history of human language: the development of Silbo Gomero, a complete whistled language capable of conveying the full range of meaning that spoken language can express. The island of La Gomera, one of the smaller and more topographically extreme Canary Islands, is deeply dissected by ravines that make land communication between its communities difficult and slow. The Guanche solution was elegant. They developed a whistled code that could carry meaningful communication across the ravines and valleys at distances up to 8 kilometers, far beyond the range of shouted speech. Silbo Gomero is not a simple signaling code like Morse. It is a complete linguistic system in which the frequencies, patterns, and modulations of a whistled signal encode the phonological structure of the local Spanish dialect with sufficient precision that fluent speakers can hold full conversations. It encodes the vocabulary, syntax, and meaning of a natural human language in a purely acoustic medium that travels far farther and attenuates less rapidly than voiced speech in open outdoor environments. The linguistic origins of Silbo-Gomero predate the Spanish conquest. The indigenous Guanche population of La Gomera had a pre-contact whistled communication system that was apparently adapted to the Spanish language after the conquest and has been maintained by the island's population ever since. UNESCO added Silbo-Gomero to its list of intangible cultural heritage in 2009, and it is now taught as a required subject in La Gomera's schools. Neuroscientific research on Silbo-Gomero has produced findings relevant to understanding how the human brain processes language. Studies using functional MRI scanning have shown that the brains of fluent Silbo speakers process the whistled signals in the same cortical areas used for natural spoken language, not in the areas associated with music or simple signal processing. The language regions of the brain recognize Silbo as language. This finding suggests that the human brain's language processing architecture is flexible enough to apply to non-vocal acoustic signals when those signals carry sufficient linguistic information. Whether this flexibility reflects a general feature of human neurology or a specific adaptation in populations that have used whistled language for generations is still being studied. The survival of Silbo-Gomero through the colonial period, when the Spanish administration sometimes discouraged or prohibited indigenous cultural practices, is itself a story of cultural resilience. The language survived partly because it was too useful to abandon. The social organization of the Guanches was more complex than early European observers typically acknowledged in their accounts, which tended to frame indigenous Atlantic peoples through frameworks of primitive simplicity. The Canary Islands were not politically unified under a single authority. Each island, and in some cases different districts within a single island, was governed by a leader called a mensi, whose authority was hereditary and whose power was described by Spanish sources as absolute within their domain. The term mensi applied specifically to the ruling class of Tenerife, but parallel institutions existed on all the main islands under different names. Guanche society was stratified, with a clear distinction between the noble class, from which the menses and other leaders were drawn, and the common population. Ancient DNA analysis of burial populations has provided direct evidence of this stratification. The skeletal remains of high-status individuals show dietary isotope profiles consistent with higher and more reliable protein consumption than those of lower-status burials, and the two groups are distributed in different burial contexts with different associated grave goods. The physical standards applied to aristocratic status were distinctive. Historical sources describe a cultural practice of deliberately fattening high-status individuals, particularly women of marriageable age from noble families, as a visible marker of prosperity and social standing. Skeletal and isotope analysis of remains from high-status burial contexts is consistent with these descriptions, shows evidence of dietary patterns that would produce the described physical characteristics. The mummification practices themselves were correlated with social status. Not all Guanche dead were mummified. The elaborate preservation process was reserved for individuals of sufficient social importance to warrant the investment of time, materials, and specialist knowledge required. The identification of individuals as high status on the basis of burial elaborateness has been cross-validated by isotope and DNA analysis in multiple cases. The specialists who performed the mummification were a distinct social group. Spanish sources from the conquest period describe a class of professional embalmers, called by a term that translates roughly as those who clean the dead, who maintained the knowledge of preservation techniques as hereditary professional knowledge. This system of specialized, heritable professional knowledge is a marker of social complexity well beyond what the primitive characterizations of European observers implied. On the island of Tenerife, near the town of Guimar, there is a complex of 6 stepped stone structures that bear an undeniable resemblance to pyramidal forms found in other ancient cultures, including Mesoamerican and Egyptian examples. The Guimar pyramids have generated more controversy than almost any other aspect of Guanche culture. For most of the 20th century, Spanish archaeologists dismissed them as field clearance mounds, piles of volcanic stone removed by farmers from agricultural land, stacked into regular shapes for convenience, with no architectural or ritual significance. This explanation was accepted by mainstream archaeology largely because the alternative, that they represented genuine monumental architecture, implied a level of cultural organization and intentionality that challenged the standard characterization of Guanche society. The situation changed significantly in the 1990s, when the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who had made his reputation by demonstrating the possibility of transoceanic voyages using ancient technologies, took an interest in the Guimar structures. Heyerdahl argued that the pyramids were genuine, intentional monuments, and that their alignment was astronomically significant. The stairways of the main pyramids face west, and are oriented toward the setting sun at the summer and winter solstices. Archaeoastronomical analysis has confirmed the solar alignment. The structures are not randomly oriented. Whether the alignment was intentional, built into the original construction, or coincidental, has been debated. But the precision of the alignment, combined with the consistent orientation across multiple structures in the complex, is more consistent with intentional design than with the field clearance interpretation. DNA. Analysis of human remains recovered from contexts in the broader Guimar region has not identified any genetic signatures inconsistent with the established Guanche population, ruling out the suggestion that the pyramids were built by a different, visiting people. Whoever built the Guimar structures, they were genetically Guanche. The Guimar site is now maintained as an ethnographic park by the Cabildo of Tenerife, with the pyramids stabilized and the surrounding area managed for public access and archaeological research. The park was partly funded and promoted by the Kon-Tiki Museum Foundation in Norway, reflecting Heyerdahl's lasting personal investment in the site's recognition. Whatever the final scholarly consensus on the pyramid's function, they represent the most visually striking surviving example of Guanche monumental construction. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands was not a swift or easy campaign. It was a struggle that lasted, intermittently, for nearly a century, from the first formal Spanish expeditions in the early 15th century to the final subjugation of Tenerife, the largest and most populous island, in 1496. The Guanches were fighting with stone-tipped weapons, wooden spears, and throwing stones against opponents equipped with steel swords, crossbows, and eventually firearms. The technological disparity was enormous, and yet the resistance was sustained. The terrain of the islands, volcanic, rugged, deeply ravined, with numerous caves and elevated positions ideal for defensive fighting, favored the defenders. Spanish expeditions suffered multiple serious defeats, including the Battle of Acentejo in 1494, where a Spanish force was routed by Guanche warriors using the terrain to devastating effect. The final conquest of Tenerife in 1496 came not through military superiority alone, but through the devastating combination of military pressure and epidemic disease. The pathogens that arrived with European contact found a completely immunologically naive population, a population that had been biologically isolated from Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years, and had no acquired immunity to the infectious diseases that European soldiers and settlers carried. The DNA evidence from skeletal remains associated with the late conquest period shows signatures of severe nutritional stress and population-level health collapse consistent with epidemic mortality. The Guanche leader, Bentor, son of the paramount chief of Tenerife, is remembered in local historical tradition for having chosen to leap from a volcanic cliff rather than surrender, an act that has made him a symbol of indigenous resistance in the Canary Islands' cultural memory ever since. The resistance of the Guanches against one of the most militarily advanced powers of the 15th century for nearly 100 years, using only Stone Age technology, is a military achievement that deserves more recognition than it typically receives in accounts focused on the European perspective. The Spanish commanders who eventually completed the conquest acknowledged the difficulty of the campaign. The final treaty that ended organized resistance on Tenerife was negotiated, not imposed, a distinction that reflects the degree to which the Guanche military capacity had made outright subjugation impossible even at the end. The battle demonstrated that the Guanche mastery of their own volcanic terrain was a genuine military asset, one that partially offset the enormous technological disparity in weaponry. The conventional historical narrative that dominated the understanding of the Canary Islands for centuries held that the Guanches had essentially ceased to exist as a people after the Spanish conquest, absorbed, assimilated, and ultimately erased by the colonial population. The ancient DNA evidence from modern Canary Islander populations has forced a fundamental revision of this narrative. Studies comparing the genetic profiles of contemporary Canary Island residents against the ancient Guanche genome have found that the indigenous Berber-derived ancestry of the Guanches has not disappeared. It persists strongly and measurably in the genomes of modern islanders, at frequencies that vary by island and by which side of the family tree is examined. The most striking finding involves the asymmetry between maternal and paternal lineages. The mitochondrial DNA of modern Canary Islanders, which traces the maternal line, shows Guanche-derived ancestry at levels ranging from 30 to 40%, depending on the island. The Y chromosome data, which traces the paternal line, shows far lower Guanche ancestry, with the majority of the paternal genetic contribution coming from European, particularly Spanish, sources. This asymmetry is the genetic signature of a specific historical pattern. The conquest and its aftermath produced a situation in which European men formed relationships, voluntary and involuntary, with Guanche women, while the male Guanche population was disproportionately killed or displaced. The surviving Guanche women's mitochondrial DNA has passed through the generations to the present day, while the male Guanche Y chromosomes were largely replaced. The Guanches did not disappear. They became the maternal ancestors of the modern Canary Islander population. Their genetic heritage flows through living people today, not as a small trace, but as a substantial biological inheritance. The broader ancient DNA evidence also documents something that the historical accounts hint at, but rarely state directly: the degree to which Guanche women's labor and knowledge underpinned the material culture of the islands. The presence of Guanche maternal lineages in Venezuelan and Puerto Rican populations has been confirmed by population genetic studies comparing modern Latin American mitochondrial DNA haplogroups against the reference Guanche ancient genomes. The Guanches left no written records. Their history has to be reconstructed from the physical evidence of archaeology, the biological evidence of DNA and isotope analysis, and the often biased accounts of Spanish observers who encountered them during and after the conquest. But within those sources, the outlines of a sophisticated and distinctive culture emerge. Medical practice among the Guanches was, by the standards of pre-literate cultures anywhere in the ancient world, remarkably advanced. Skeletal analysis of Guanche remains has documented evidence of trepanation, the surgical drilling or cutting of holes in the skull, in multiple individuals, and crucially, in individuals who survived the procedure. Healed bone around the surgical openings confirms that these patients lived for significant periods after their trepanation, indicating that the Guanches had developed surgical techniques capable of penetrating the skull without causing immediate fatal infection or hemorrhage. This level of surgical competence was not universal, even in literate ancient civilizations. The treatment of wounds and diseases relied extensively on the pharmacological properties of plants available on the islands. The sap of the dragon tree, Dracaena draco, a distinctive species native to Macaronesia, was used medicinally and also played a role in the mummification process. Chemical analysis of residues from Guanche mummies and associated burial materials has confirmed the presence of compounds from dragon tree resin, pine pitch, and other plant substances with documented antibacterial and preservative properties. The spiritual world of the Guanches was organized around the concept of Guayota, a malevolent spirit associated with the volcano of Mount Teide, the great stratovolcano that dominates Tenerife, and whose eruptions the Guanches would have witnessed and feared. Opposing Guayota was a creator deity called Achaman, who was associated with the sky and the sun. The ritual significance of Teide, visible from every point on Tenerife and from the sea for hundreds of kilometers, was central to Guanche religious practice. The DNA of the domestic animals that the Guanches kept has also been analyzed in parallel with the human genomic work. The plant pharmacology knowledge of the Guanches, partially preserved in the accounts of Spanish missionaries and physicians who observed the indigenous healers, remains a subject of ongoing ethnobotanical research into the medicinal properties of Canary Island endemic plant species. Let's bring the whole story together. Because the Guanche case is not just a regional archaeological curiosity. It is one of the most instructive examples in the entire record of how ancient DNA science can transform our understanding of human history. Before the 2017 study, the Guanches existed in a space where mythology and archaeology overlapped uncomfortably. The Atlantis theories, the suggestions of pre-Columbian American contact, the comparisons with Egyptian mummification that implied some mysterious shared tradition, all of these ideas filled the explanatory vacuum left by the absence of direct genetic evidence. People wanted the Guanches to be mysterious in the romantic sense, survivors of something lost, bearers of connections that crossed the ancient world in secret. The DNA gave a different answer. Not less interesting, just more grounded. The Guanches were North African Berbers who had crossed the narrow ocean gap between the African mainland and the Canary Islands, most likely in the period between 1000 and 500 BC, and had then lived in complete isolation from the rest of the world for somewhere between 1 and 2,000 years. During that time, they developed independently the same general solution to the problem of preserving the dead that Egyptian civilization had developed in a completely different context. Remove the organs, dry the body, wrap it carefully. The same challenge produced a similar solution, not because of cultural contact, but because the physics of decomposition and the logic of preservation are the same everywhere. The Guanche genetic legacy in modern Canary Islanders, substantial in the maternal line, reduced but present in the paternal line, documents both the survival and the transformation of a culture. The Guanche language is gone, though linguistic researchers have reconstructed a substantial portion of its vocabulary from place names and words borrowed into local Spanish. The genetic persistence of Guanche ancestry in modern Latin American populations is also documented. The Canary Islands served as a significant point of embarkation for the colonization of the Americas, particularly Venezuela, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, in the 16th through 18th centuries. Canary Islander emigrants to the Americas carried with them the admixed genetic heritage of Spanish and Guanche ancestry, meaning that Guanche-derived mitochondrial DNA lineages are now distributed across parts of the Caribbean and South America. The mummification practice is gone. The Mensi system of governance is gone. The ancient DNA of the Guanches speaks across a millennium, confirming an African origin, documenting an island evolution, and tracing a genetic thread that has survived into the living population of both the Canary Islands and the Americas.